Here's what most people think Weak Hero is. A fight manhwa about a small, brilliant kid who beats up bullies with physics and cold calculation. A power fantasy for the academically gifted. Revenge porn with better choreography. They're wrong. Weak Hero is a story about what happens to a mind when it has nowhere else to go. It's about a boy who looked at the world, understood exactly how brutal it was, and decided, not out of courage, but out of necessity, that he would refuse to be destroyed by it. The fighting is almost incidental. What the manhwa is actually tracking, panel by panel, is the interior architecture of a person who has converted chronic vulnerability into a system of survival so precise it looks like confidence. You've been reading it as an action story. It's a trauma response with a runtime. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. Yeon, Gray, enters the story as a problem. Not a protagonist in the traditional sense, a problem. He is physically slight, socially unreadable, and arrives at Yoonjang with no allies, no reputation, and no apparent interest in acquiring either. In a school ecosystem built entirely on physical hierarchy, he is, on paper, the perfect target. His background is not spelled out in dramatic flashback. The manhwa is smarter than that. What we get instead are traces. The way he moves through space, the way he processes threats before most people have even registered them as threats, the way he relates to other people with a detachment that reads as arrogance but is, if you look closer, something more like armor. Gray is not cold because he doesn't feel things. He is cold because he learned at some point before the story begins that feeling things visibly was a liability he couldn't afford. His body was always going to be the weaker instrument. So he built something else. He built a mind that operates the way a chess engine operates, not reacting to the board as it is, but calculating the board as it will be. That's not a personality trait. That's an adaptation. 1. Shame as fuel. There's a psychological concept sometimes called post-traumatic growth. The idea that extreme adversity doesn't just damage people, it can, under certain conditions, restructure them. It burns away what was soft and leaves something harder and more functional in its place. Gray is a case study in this, but the manhwa never lets it become triumphant. It stays honest about the cost. His early humiliations, and there are many implied and shown, didn't produce rage. They produced information. Every time he was physically overwhelmed, every time he was made to feel small, he was also learning something. How people with power behave when they think they won't face consequences, where the weaknesses are in someone who relies entirely on physical dominance. How much a bully system depends on the victim accepting the assigned role. Gray took notes. Not literally, psychologically. He ran the experiment enough times that he stopped being the variable and started being the analyst. The specific genius of the manhwa is that when we watch Gray act, we're not watching improvisation. We're watching the execution of conclusions he reached long before this particular fight, this particular school, this particular bully. His responses feel preternaturally calm because they are not responses. They are implementations. The shame was the research phase. The fight is the presentation. This is why his violence, when it comes, is so forensically precise. He's not hitting people out of anger. He's applying force to the exact structural weakness he identified 3 moves ago. The emotion was processed privately, in advance. What we see is the output. 2. Hypervigilance as survival skill. Clinically, hypervigilance is a symptom. It appears in trauma survivors, in people whose nervous systems have been calibrated by environments where threats could arrive without warning. The body learns to run continuous threat assessment, scanning faces, reading micro-expressions, anticipating escalation before it announces itself. In a therapeutic context, it's a response you try to de-escalate. In Gray's context, it's a weapon. He walks into rooms and within seconds he has mapped every power dynamic in it. He clocks who defers to whom, who is performing confidence and who actually has it, where the fracture lines are. This isn't presented as a superpower. It's presented as something that costs him. The hypervigilance that keeps him safe also keeps him isolated because you cannot simultaneously maintain constant threat assessment and genuine intimacy. The two modes are incompatible. But here's what makes Gray genuinely terrifying to the people who try to dominate him. Bullies in this manhwa, and in Korean school culture broadly, depend on a specific dynamic. They depend on unpredictability. The threat of sudden violence is only a threat if the target cannot see it coming, cannot process it fast enough, cannot react. The power of intimidation is fundamentally informational. I know something about what I'm about to do to you that you don't know yet. Gray collapses that asymmetry. He's already done the calculation. By the time the aggression arrives, he's been waiting for it. And there is almost nothing more disorienting to someone who relies on dominance than a target who is visibly, calmly not afraid. Not because they're brave, because they saw it coming, planned for it, and decided it was manageable. The hypervigilance that was imposed on him by vulnerability becomes, in his hands, a structural advantage. 3. Strategic humiliation resistance. This is the piece that most readings of Weak Hero miss because it's quiet. It happens in the gaps between action sequences. When someone attempts to humiliate Gray, and this happens repeatedly in different registers, the normative script has two available responses. You absorb the humiliation, you internalize it, and the social hierarchy is reinforced. Or you react emotionally, you retaliate without strategy, and you give the aggressor exactly what they need, confirmation that they reached you, that they have the power to destabilize you. Gray does neither. What he does instead is something more sophisticated and, I'd argue, more psychologically interesting. He performs a real-time recategorization of what is actually happening. He doesn't reject the humiliation emotionally. He reframes it analytically. He looks at the person attempting to diminish him and he reads it not as a verdict on himself, but as data about them, their insecurity, their need for an audience, their dependence on his participation in their script, and then he declines to participate. This isn't stoicism in the traditional sense. Stoicism is about emotional regulation, feeling things and choosing not to act on them. What Gray does is closer to a cognitive re-architecture of the situation. He changes what the moment means before it has the chance to become what it was designed to be. The humiliation never lands because by the time it arrives, he's already reclassified it as something that reveals more about its source than its target. The effect on the people around him is almost eerie. They push, and there's no resistance. Not because he's absorbed the impact, but because he's simply relocated himself outside the frame they built for him. He refuses the role, not loudly, just completely. To understand why this resonates, you have to understand the specific brutality of Korean school culture as a social system, not as a backdrop, but as the architecture the story is built inside. Korean secondary schools operate within a hierarchy that is intensely physical and intensely codified. Seniority commands deference. Strength, real or performed, translates directly into social capital. The violence that happens in these environments is rarely random. It is, in a terrible way, structural. It is the system enforcing its own logic. And the specific punishment for being perceived as weak is not just physical. It is social erasure. To be weak is to be illegible to the hierarchy. You don't register, you don't count. Gray is a character who should not exist in this system. He is small, he is solitary, he does not perform deference, and he is not physically dominant. The system has a very clear category for him, and that category is victim. What the manhwa interrogates is whether that category is inescapable or whether it's a construct that can be refused. And it's careful not to make the answer easy or clean. Gray can refuse the category, but refusal has costs. The isolation isn't incidental, it's the price. He wins by the system's metrics often enough, but he cannot fully live inside a system he has decided to treat as an opponent rather than a community. That tension between survival and belonging, between strategic distance and the loneliness it produces, is why this story lands so hard for so many readers. It's not wish fulfillment, it's recognition. The title is not ironic. That's the last thing I want to leave you with. The most common reading is that Gray is called the weak hero because he's actually strong, that the title inverts expectation, sets up the subversion, underlines the twist. But that reading is too simple, and it lets the manhwa off the hook for something much more difficult it's actually doing. Gray is weak. By the metric the world around him uses, physical dominance, social legibility, the capacity to take up space without cost, he is genuinely, structurally weak. The manhwa doesn't pretend otherwise. It holds that fact in one hand, and in the other hand it holds this. He is also engineered through suffering and intelligence and a refusal so deep it has become a character trait to survive a world that was designed to consume him. The title is the thesis. Weak, yes. Hero, also, yes. Not despite the weakness, not in spite of it, through it, because of it. The weakness is the condition, the engineering is the response, and the distance between those two things is where Yeon Si-eun lives, where the story actually takes place if you know where to look. Go back and read it again. You'll find him there.